archive it for SS. Hello, good afternoon, good morning to our Taiwan faculty members and students, and good evening to our friends and students in Dallas. And we are so pleased and so honored to have Professor Larry Bartels to give a talk today to data analytics data analytics colloquium. And this colloquium is organized to invite top-notch scholars and data scientists to give talk on data science methods and latest research, and also now particularly uh, on topics that we are most concerned, which is the U.S. elections. And now we have uh, Professor Patel here getting ready for our speech. Maybe I can have Professor Peter Pan quickly talk about the colloquium. Then I will introduce Dr. Patels.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Uh,
Thank you.
for everyone's here, of course, good morning from Taiwan. Greetings from Taiwan. Thank you, Professor Bartels, for it's really an honor to have you here. So for the deck, that's why we shortened as a deck, Data Analytic Colloquiums. Carl and I, we try to establish this platform for the purpose of getting people around the world, hopefully, and then we try to share all the messages and academic findings in all kinds of topics, generally social sciences, and so we can learn from each other. For most of the part, I'm learning from, for example, Dr. Bartels for all the methods and how we analyze the data. So this is how we started this colloquium, and it's really an honor and a very thank to Carl and all his connections, so that we can have Dr. Bartels that you're here today, and also we have Dr. Aiken and Dr. Clark. So they already finished their presentation, but I think probably they will be here today, maybe. So a lot of thanks I want to give to, but I hope that all the guests here will enjoy the presentations or the guests that we invited and learn a lot of insights from all these presentations. Carl?
All right, thank you, Peter. Um, I also should introduce myself. My name is Carl Ho. I'm at UT Dallas and associate professor of instruction. So we are here to um, organize this colloquium. Allow me to give me a short time. Then let me introduce Professor Bartels. Professor Bartel is the May Worthen Shane Chair of Public Policy and Social Science at Vanderbilt University, and he is an award-winning author and also teacher, and his recent studies on political inequality and is really well cited, one of the most influential works in political science. His most recent book, and maybe I think it's the most recent book, is on it's titled "Unequal Democracy: The Political Economy of the New Gilded Age." Now it's the second edition, and also another book, "Democracy for Realists: Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government." That is the book co-author with Professor Christopher Aiken. Now today he will give us a talk, and the title of the talk is the political impact of economic change. Without further ado, let me introduce Professor Bartels. Yeah.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you this morning or this evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. I should say that I'm happy to be interrupted at any time if what I say isn't clear to people. Happy to make this a conversation rather than a lecture. We'll probably all learn more from it that way. The title is Political Impact of Economic Change. Thought I could advance my slides. There we go. This is co-authored work with my good friend Catherine Kramer, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And this particular part of our work is inspired by a common interpretation of the 2016 election result. One of the things that people noticed in the immediate wake of the election is that there was a shift away from the Democratic Party and toward President Trump and the Republican Party among.
Hello, Larry. Sorry,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Larry, somehow
Yes.
your screen is not showing the full screen. Can you check that? And we only see a part of the PowerPoint presentation. Can you
Okay.
check
Get
if it
out of
is?
that and then try and get back in.
Yeah, let's try that again.
That better?
Yeah, looks good now. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. People noticed that there was a shift toward President Trump and the Republican Party in parts of the country that were economically distressed, especially places where there had been factory closings and that kind of thing, and also a shift at the individual level among white voters without college educations. And a common interpretation of those patterns was that people were angered or frustrated by long-term income stagnation. One of the most striking features of the American political economy over the last 30 years or so is that although incomes at the top of the distribution have been growing pretty robustly, the incomes of more ordinary workers have not increased very much in real terms for a long time. And so here are some examples of things that people wrote about the election: that Trump tapped into the anger of a declining middle class, that his white working class supporters have suffered a stunning loss of relative status over the past 40 years, and that he won because many millions of Americans, having endured decades of working more while getting deeper in debt, said enough. Well, one of Trump's big fans is a person that I'll call Ron Sutton. He's a retiree in his early 70s, and he lives in an economically stagnant part of the rural South and heavily white part of the South. The county that he lives in is 95% white. Mr. Sutton owned a tire store that went out of business when the big manufacturing plant in town closed down several years ago. And he says that uncontrolled immigration drives the wages down. I believe that. I wish they would put out what it costs for one illegal immigrant that comes into this country with a child, what it costs the American taxpayer. He also went on to say that Trump is the first politician of either race, of either party, that ran on a platform and has tried every way in the world to carry exactly what he set out. In other words, I'm going to do this, and he's tried to do this every way he could. He says, I'm going to change the economy. I'm going to reduce the taxes. I'm going to bring industrial jobs back to this country, which he's done a great job on that. But if Trump said, I'm going to pay off the national debt tomorrow with gold out of my own vault, the Democrats would vote against it. So this is clearly somebody whose enthusiasm for Trump seems to fit the conventional story of economic stagnation. His factory closed in response to the sorts of economic distress that people have often focused on. But if we trace Sutton's economic fortunes and his political attitudes over his lifetime, we get a very different impression of the factors that are motivating him and his enthusiasm for President Trump. It turns out that Sutton was an ardent conservative and a strong Republican long before Trump came along, before he came onto the political scene. And his political views were forged in the course of his rise from a relatively modest background to rank in the top 1 or 2% of the national income distribution. So this is really an instance not of somebody who was troubled by economic stagnation, but really somebody who was a terrific success story in terms of his own economic mobility. So what we're going to do in this project is to explore how long-term economic mobility affects political views more generally. Now, in conventional surveys, we can get some sense of people's current economic and social status and maybe their impressions about how things are changed, but we can't directly measure something like loss of relative status over the past 40 years or decades of working more while getting deeper in debt. Similarly, aggregate analyses based on county level data, which there have been a fair number in connection with the 2016 election, may capture economic and social change at the aggregate level, but they don't capture personal experience of economic or social mobility. And so the data that we're going to turn to in order to try and shed some new light on these questions is called the Student Parent Socialization Study. It was originally conducted by a political scientist named M. Kent Jennings in collaboration with Richard Nemi. And they began with interviews in 1965 with almost 1,700 high school seniors who were students in 97 different schools across the US. The schools were selected to be representative of the national high school population. They interviewed the students. They also interviewed one or both parents of each student, and they interviewed some of the social studies teachers in these schools to try and create a rounded picture of the influences that might be affecting the students' political views. Now, given the nature of that design, the most important limitation of these data that I want you to bear in mind as we go along is that the study misses entirely people who dropped out of high school before the end of their senior year of high school. These people are being interviewed toward the end of their senior year. And so people who had already left school by that point don't appear in the sample. And that's about 1/4 of the cohort in the mid 1960s. So we're missing basically the least educated 1/4 of the population as we observe this cohort moving on through time. Now, the results of that study were reported by Jennings and Nemi in a very influential book called The Political Character of Adolescence, The Influence of Families and Schools. But for our purposes, what's even more useful is that they continued this study for quite some time afterward. It became the Political Socialization Panel Study. First, the students and their parents were re-interviewed in 1973, so this is 8 years after the original study. They're in their mid-20s at that point. And again, Jennings and Nemi published a book based on that study called Generations and Politics, a panel study of young adults and their parents. And then the students were re-interviewed a third time in 1982. So now they're in their mid-30s. And then a fourth time in 1997 when they're about 50 years old. So we have a ongoing record of changes in their political attitudes from the time they graduated from high school in 1965 through the late period of their working careers in 1997. Of the original 1,669 students, 935 were successfully interviewed in all 4 waves of the survey. So 56% of the original sample were successfully re-interviewed all 4 times. And that constitutes the longest running study ever of Americans' political attitudes. What we're going to do in our analysis is to weight the responses from these 935 people in order to replicate the distribution of race, region, sex, partisanship, and political interest in the original sample in order to mitigate the impact of panel attrition. And so here's a kind of picture of what that weighting scheme looks like. Larger numbers here are sets of characteristics that are going to be overweighted because they suffered a higher than average level of attrition over the course of the study. Lower numbers are people whose responses are going to be relatively downweighted because they had lower levels of attrition over the course of the panel. We're also going to use some data that we collected ourselves in the last few years. We've gone back and talked to 30 of these people so far, not to repeat the kinds of questions that they were asked in the Jennings survey, but rather to have semi-structured conversations with them, reviewing their lives and their political attitudes and how they think about contemporary politics. And so this is partly giving us a sense of how their political attitudes continued to change after the last wave of the survey in 1997, but also allowing us to get some sense of their own perspectives on their political development. These 30 people are not a random sample, even of the set who participated in all four waves. One of the things we've done is clustered them on the basis of geography. So we've generally interviewed several people in a particular part of the country. Often what we'll do is go and stay in that part of the country for several days and conduct one or two interviews a day with these people, mostly going to their homes to talk with them. We've interviewed people in the upper Midwest, in New England, the rural South, and Northern California, as well as a few in other parts of the country. So it's not a random sample, but there's a good deal of diversity in their characteristics. And because we have this rich panel data that gives us insights into how their political attitudes have changed over the course of their lives, we've been able to focus as well on people who seem like they might be particularly interesting based on their past survey responses. So for example, we've looked for people who changed over the course of their lives from being Democrats to being Republicans, and people who changed from being Republicans to being Democrats. In several cases, we've interviewed several people who were students in the same high school, and so we can, in a sense, make comparisons holding constant a lot of the social context in which they grew up and seeing how their subsequent political views diverged or not as a function of changes in their life experiences. As I said, these are open-ended conversations, mostly in people's homes. They typically averaged about an hour and a half or 2 hours each. Professor Kramer conducted all of the interviews. I participated in about half of them. So the first thing I want to talk about is the relationship between social backgrounds and economic mobility. I'm going to think especially about two aspects of these people's social backgrounds. One is what I'll call family SES, which is a summary measure based on 8 separate indicators in the 1965 survey of the students' parents' education, income, home ownership, occupational prestige, and so on. Most of these indicators are based on responses from the parents rather than from the high school students themselves. Then there's a measure that I'll refer to as school SES, which is simply the average family SES of all of the students who were interviewed in a particular school. So there are somewhere between 13 and 21 students interviewed in each school, and we take the average of their family SES as an indication of the context of the school itself, and in most cases, since these are neighborhood schools, the context of the neighborhood in which the respondent grew up. And then we're going to look at how those factors influence economic mobility, which is measured by changes in the real family incomes that respondents reported in each wave of the survey. So here's what those relationships look like. We're looking here at the average difference in real family income as a function of variation, first in family SES, which are these gray bars, and then in school SES, which are the green bars. The difference between men and women, which are the gold colored bars, and the difference between people who expressed more secular or more religious views. It turns out that people who were less attached to religion in adolescence generally experienced higher levels of economic mobility over the course of their subsequent lives in part because they were more likely to go to college. We also, in the paper, have some analysis of college going and the factors that figure into that. But you see, if you look across these three sets of bars that refer to the second, third, fourth waves of the survey, generally the effects are growing over time. That's partly just a function of the fact that these people's real incomes are typically growing over the course of their lives, over their course of their experience in the workforce. But some of them are growing faster than others. For example, if you compare the effect of family SES and school SES, 8 years after the original study, they both have roughly similar effects on income growth for students at different levels of SES. But then by 1982, when these people are in their middle 30s, it looks as though school SES has a much larger impact on economic mobility than family SES does. And in 1997, you see an even greater divergence, with school SES being the most important factor accounting for economic mobility at the age of 50. There's also an increase in gender differences. That's not simply a function of more men being in the workforce, since we're focusing here on family incomes. What it mostly represents is the differential impact on men and women of divorce. In many cases, when 50s has been divorced, he's still living off his own income. A woman in her 50s who's been divorced often is having a hard time making ends meet because she's not sharing in her former husband's income, and to the extent that she's in the labor force herself, often has a less well-paying job. So there's an indication here of how other kinds of life events figure into economic mobility, at least indirectly. But I think it's striking that these factors that we can measure when the students are 18 years of age continue to have big and even increasing impact on their economic status decades later. We also want to use the panel data to gauge the impact of economic mobility on political attitudes. And in doing that, we're going to focus on changes in political attitudes by incorporating lagged versions of the dependent variables. We're also going to rely on lagged versions of the explanatory variables, which makes it easier to attribute causal significance to the relationships that we're observing in the data. If we observe a connection between two variables at a particular point in time, it's often hard to know to what extent one is causing the other. But if we looked at the lagged version of the explanatory variables, we have a better fighting chance, at least, of being able to sort out causal relationships. And finally, we're going to use errors in variables regression techniques to mitigate biases due to measurement error in survey responses. Most of these variables are very simple questions where people pick a point on a 1 to 7 scale, or they agree or disagree with a particular survey item. And we've known for decades that there's a lot of random error in those kinds of responses, and that if we can take account of it in our statistical analyses, we'll get much more accurate estimates of the magnitude of the impact of these explanatory variables on dependent variables. All three of those characteristics are general advantages of analyzing panel data that are summarized in a piece that I published several years ago called 3 Virtues of Panel Data for the Analysis of Campaign Effects. In taking account of measurement error, we're going to rely on the fact that we have these waves of panel data for each respondent. The model that I'm employing here, which is a model that was developed by Wiley and Wiley in 1970, assumes that the measurement error variance for each survey item is constant across the survey waves, and that it's uncorrelated with true attitudes and with errors in other items. And in that case, the 3 waves of data are sufficient to estimate the measurement error variance for a given survey item, and also its reliability in each wave, which is just the ratio of true variance to total variance. And so I'm going to take those estimates of reliability and employ them in Stata's EIV regression command, which uses the estimated reliabilities to adjust the variance covariance matrix of the variables and thus to adjust the parameter estimates that you get out of the regression analysis. So here are some of the variables that are incorporated in our project, and just a kind of taste of what the measurement errors and estimated reliabilities look like. The first column here is the measurement error on a standard deviation as measured on the 0 to 100 scale that I'm using to measure each of these attitudes. So you can see the typical measurement error runs from something like 10 points on the 100-point scale up to 25 or even 30 points on the 100-point scale for some of the less well-measured items. If we can know the measurement error, or can estimate the measurement error, then we have an estimate of the error variance, which is the second column, and we can use that to compute the estimated reliability of the indicator in each wave of the survey. The estimated reliability changes even though the measurement error is assumed to be constant because the true variance in these measures is changing from survey wave to survey wave. But if you look across these various explanatory variables, you can see that there's a fair amount of variation in how reliably they're measured. Party identification is very well measured by comparison with most other kinds of political attitudes. Church attendance and faith in the Bible are generally quite reliably measured, but many of the other attitude variables that I'm going to be working with here are much less well measured. And so taking account of that fact provides more accurate estimates of the relative impact of these various factors in the analyses that we're going to be conducting. Now, conveniently for our purposes here, the waves of the Jennings panel happen to bracket neatly two economically and politically distinct time periods in America. The gap between the second wave in 1973 and the third wave in 1982 captures what's often referred to by historians as the era of stagflation. It was an era marked by economic recession, slow income growth, and high inflation, and politically by significant conservative shifts in a variety of economic and social views. And then the period between the third and fourth waves of the survey, between 1982 and 1997, is a period marked by somewhat higher economic growth rates, but also by escalating economic inequality. And it was a period in which many of the conservative trends that appeared in the 70s and early 80s were halted or partially reversed. So what I'm going to do is to look separately at shifts over each of those two periods and try and think about how they're related to the social context and political context of the period. Here's an example of what some of these analyses look like. I have two measures of economic attitudes in the 1982 survey. One is an assessment of how favorably people feel about labor unions by comparison with big business. And that's based on a comparison of what are called feeling thermometers, where people rate how positively or negatively they feel about each of those two groups. The other item is an item that's been asked frequently in the American National Election Studies and in other surveys that asks people about whether the government should be involved in ensuring that everyone has a job and a decent standard of living. So those are going to be two of the several dependent variables that I'm analyzing. Those attitudes are being measured in 1982, but you'll see that we also have a lag-dependent variable here, which is a measure of the same attitude in the 1973 survey. We're going to look at the impact of economic mobility as measured by changes in family income, just the difference in the incomes that these respondents reported in the 1982 survey and the 1973 survey, and then a variety of other variables that we expect to have some impact on changing political views, including how long they spent in college, a racial difference between whites and non-whites, sex difference between men and women, a variable that indicates people who grew up in the South, which was a politically distinctive part of the country in that period, a measure of people's interpretation of the Bible, how religiously they interpret the Bible, and a measure of party identification from 1973 as well. And the parameter estimates that are reported here are errors in variable regression parameter estimates with standard errors in parentheses. If you look at these two columns, you can see that there are some significant differences in the patterns. For example, looking at the impact of the lag-dependent variables, it looks as though the attitudes that people had toward labor unions and big business were quite stable over this period. Virtually 100% of the attitudes that they reported in 1973 persisted until 1982. By comparison, the attitudes about government jobs and living standards were much less stable. Less than 40% of their responses from 1973 persisted until 1982. And much of the reason for that difference has to do with the fact that party identification had a big impact on shifts in attitudes with respect to these economic variables over the period from 1973 to 1982. So whereas attitudes about labor and business had already been pretty well activated when people were in their mid-20s, attitudes about government jobs and living standards became increasingly politicized along partisan lines during the period of the late 1970s and early 1980s. So we see very different shifts in views among people who had in 1973 reported that they were Republicans and those who had reported that they were Democrats. But in both cases, if you look back up at the first column of results here, you see that there's a negative impact of changes in family income in the period between 1973 and 1982 on the extent to which people felt warmly toward labor unions by comparison with big business, and on the extent to which they thought the government should be involved in social welfare provision. And so in both cases, what we're seeing is a conservative shift among the people who are upwardly economically mobile. The greater their increases in family income, the lower their scores in terms of their feelings about labor relative to business and in terms of their support for government involvement in these economic areas. So rather than economic decline producing conservative shifts, we see a pretty strong pattern in which economic mobility, upward economic mobility, is producing conservative shifts, especially for the more politicized item about the role of government. Here's a kind of summary of what those two patterns look like. First, for 1973 to 1982, you see that there are shifts in a conservative direction with respect to both indicators, a bigger shift for the question about government ensuring jobs and living standards than for the one about labor unions and big business. But in both cases, the conservative shift is concentrated among people who were upwardly economically mobile by comparison with those whose incomes increased more slowly during this period between their middle 20s and their middle 30s. In the next interval between 1982 and 1997, now we're looking at a 15-year gap between the survey waves. In those two periods, you can see that there was something of a rebound in attitudes. People's views about labor unions became relatively more favorable by comparison with big business. And to a lesser extent, there was some shift in a liberal direction in terms of their attitudes about government involvement in ensuring jobs and living standards. But here too, you see that the liberal shift, insofar as there was one, was concentrated among people who were downwardly economically mobile, those who had smaller or no increases in real family income during this 15-year period, whereas there were small effects, if any, among the people who were upwardly mobile. So in both periods, although the overall trends are somewhat different, we see the same kind of differentiation qualitatively, with the people who were upwardly mobile looking more conservative and the people who were downwardly mobile looking more liberal. Economic mobility also produced conservative shifts in a variety of other attitudes we looked at, including economic and also some social attitudes, particularly in that first interval between 1973 and 1982. More conservative views about government spending and services, aid to minorities, attitudes toward people on welfare, and also things that didn't have anything very directly to do with economic issues or policy preferences, but rather social concerns like concern about crime and the rights of accused criminals. Between 1982 and 1997, it looks as though the shifts, insofar as they were related to economic mobility, were more concentrated in the economic domain, having to do with things like faith in the free market and views about the political influence of rich people. There's also some evidence, especially in the later period between 1982 and 1997, that escalating economic inequality may have pushed Americans to the left. Go back here to the analysis I showed you. The one variable that I didn't talk about in introducing the results is a measure of the change in state economic inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient at the state level between 1973 and 1982, and then in the next wave between 1982 and 1997. So what we did was to look at how those variations across state in the increase in economic inequality were related to shifts in political attitudes. And we found a pretty strong correlation between larger increases in state level economic inequality and liberal shifts in political views. That's suggestive of the possibility that the overall growth in economic inequality during America in this period shift the overall distribution of opinion to the left. Unfortunately, it's hard to know for sure that that's what happened, because it so happens that the states that had largest increases in economic inequality during this period were very different from the ones that had smaller increases in economic inequality. And so there are lots of potentially confounding factors that make this relationship suggestive, but certainly not statistically definitive. One of the things that we're looking at is to see whether we can get more fine-grained measures of inequality in specific locales that might help us to differentiate better the impact of increasing economic inequality from other factors that might be pushing people in a liberal direction during this period of the 1980s and 90s. Now I want to flesh these results out a little bit by talking about the information that we got from our more qualitative interviews with some of these people. I'm going to focus in particular on two people to give you a flavor of the underlying distinction here. One is the person I interviewed, Ron Sutton. The other person is a person we'll call Don Payton, who had graduated from the same high school that Ron Sutton did. They both grew up in the rural South and graduated from a high school in a small community in the South, which was one of the poorest schools in the entire Jennings sample, one of the handful of poorest places among the 97 where these interviews were conducted. And so I'm just going to contrast these people's backgrounds and attitudes. On the left is Payton. His father was a taxi driver. He became a musician and local radio personality, and his family income in all three waves was well below the national average income. And as I've already indicated, on the other side, Ron Sutton, his father owned the local tire store when he was growing up. And so although he lived in a poor community, he wasn't as poor as his fellow students were. And then Ron himself owned his own business, and the income from that business put him in the top 1 or 2% of the national distribution of incomes in middle age, even though he had come from such a poor community. After his own business closed, he then became the regional manager for a large construction firm. So he was still making substantial income by comparison with not only the people he grew up with, but most of the people in the entire sample. Peyton, on the left, favored increased government spending and services when he was asked about that in the surveys. He said people on welfare have too little influence. He said we need a strong government to solve the country's problems, and was a committed lifelong Democrat. In every wave of the survey, he reported a strong attachment to the Democratic Party. In contrast, Sutton strongly favored cuts in government spending and services. He said people on welfare have too much influence, that the free market can handle economic problems, and his overall partisan views shifted substantially over time. When he was in high school, he reported being a strong Democrat, and then by his mid 30s, he was leaning toward the Republican Party. 97, the last of the Jennings interviews, he reported that he was a strong Republican. On the left, we've got to lift up the downtrodden. We've got to help the folks that don't have the same opportunities we do. There are a lot of people on welfare that don't need to be. You just have to try to square that away and make sure that they need to be. On the right, every social program there is a failure. The government can't run anything right. And then referring at another point in the interview to his childhood neighbors, he says, they were hardworking people and the government didn't subsidize them. They didn't have a choice. They didn't know what food stamps or welfare was. One of the things that was happening at the time that we talked to these guys, which was a couple of years ago now, was that the government was shut down due to a dispute between the Trump administration and Congress about the funding of the Trump border wall along the border with Mexico. And we asked them what they thought about that situation. Again, pretty striking differences in their responses. On the left, federal employees are laid off and they just went through Christmas and there's no check there right now. He said that President Trump had been very cavalier about that, and that makes me really angry that he's cavalier with other people's paychecks. And Sutton on the right, they're going to get paid. And if you're not financially stable enough to go to a bank anywhere and say, I need to borrow $5,000 to get me by till I get paid. So, hey, I'd like for you to hand me a 4-week paid vacation or 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever. So he's not only not sympathizing much with these people, but given his own economic background and experiences, he thinks it ought to be no big thing for them to just go to the bank and borrow $5,000 if they need that to get through, which is not an experience that most ordinary people would find that easy. And then finally, in response to a very broad question that we asked most of these people at the end of our survey about what advice or wisdom they'd like to share with the entire country, Peyton on the left urges people to have faith, keep your faith that things will get better, and do your part. Work hard to try to help things be better, starting out in your own community. Just be nice to folks and do the right thing, and the rest will take care of itself. And then Sutton on the right, be a productive American citizen. Don't live off somebody else or the government. Go for it yourself. So you can see that in all sorts of ways, these two people have very different attitudes about the way society works, about the economy, about the role of government. And those views seem to be rooted in their lifetime experiences, despite the fact that they grew up in the same distinctive, relatively poor rural community. Their subsequent life experiences produced very different set of attitudes. So in conclusion, with respect to political and social views, we find that conservative shifts in economic attitudes were concentrated among upwardly mobile people, not those with stagnant incomes. Economically privileged groups, the college educated, whites, males, and Republicans, also became relatively more conservative over time. Some, but not all, social attitudes showed parallel shifts, with economic winners pulling away from the rest of society, especially during the era of stagflation. The other thing we want to do is to think about how economic mobility may have affected shifts in partisanship over time. You can see here a kind of summary of the partisan division between Republicans in red and Democrats in blue among the people in this cohort from the time they were first interviewed in 1965 through 1997. In 1965, there were overwhelmingly Democratic identifiers. That's not surprising, partly because they were young people, but also more importantly, because the Democratic Party was at a kind of historic high point in the middle 1960s. Lyndon Johnson had just won a huge landslide re-election in 1964, and young people in particular had been swayed in many cases by the presidency of John Kennedy, who was a charismatic young Democratic president while they were growing up. So in the interviews that we did with people, many of them referred spontaneously to Kennedy as an important political influence on them. So in high school, more than half reported being Democrats and only about 30% reported being Republicans. But then you can see that as they aged, the partisan balance became much more equal. You also see that there's a decline over time in the proportion of these people who describe themselves as independents or neutral between the two political parties. By 1997, when they're age 50, the vast majority of them have chosen up sides, and by that time, they're roughly equally divided between Republican and Democratic loyalties. Part of that shift has to do with the shift in the connection between the Democratic and Republican parties and the issue of race. There was a bigger realignment, especially in the southern part of the US, starting in the 1960s and continuing for the entire period of this study, basically, in which Southerners became more Republican. But there are also lots of people outside the South who became Republican over the course of their lives. And so what we want to do is to see how those partisan shifts were related to people's experiences with the economy, and in particular to their actual income growth as reported in the surveys over time, and also to a question that was included in the final survey in 1997 about subjective mobility, whether people thought of themselves as better or worse off than their parents had been. And what I'm showing you here is the shift in the Republican margin of partisanship in each group between successive waves of the survey. And since African Americans responded to the political changes of this era much differently than whites did, I'm focusing here only on whites, where Republican gains are mostly concentrated. So if you look at the period between 1973 and 1982, you see that there was a increase of 15 or 20 points in the Republican margin of identification among people who had above average levels of income growth. For people who had below average but positive income growth, that's the middle shaded red bar here, you see that the Republican margin gain was less than 5 percentage points. And among people whose real incomes actually declined, who are a relatively small number, you see no Republican gains at all, really. In the next period between 1982 and 1997, a similar kind of pattern, a 10 or 15 point shift in the margin among people with above average income growth, and virtually no gains at all among people with below average income growth. And then compounding over both of those periods, the whole shift from 1973 to 1997, we see about a 25 percentage point shift in the Republican margin among people with above average income growth, so very substantial Republican gains cumulatively among that group. But among people with below average income growth or people whose real incomes actually declined, we see much smaller cumulative Republican gains. And then finally, with respect to the question about subjective mobility, people who said that they were better off or just as well off as their parents had been uh, showed big shifts in the direction of Republican partisanship over this entire period, whereas people who said that they were worse off than their parents, the kinds of people who actually felt that they had experienced the long-term economic distress that was referred to in those newspaper articles and political commentary that I referred to in the very beginning of the talk with respect to President Trump were actually the ones who remained quite loyal to the Democratic Party over the course of their entire working lives. So contrary to the stereotype of a Republican backlash rooted in long-term economic grievances, what we see is exactly the opposite. Republican gains in partisanship were highly concentrated among upwardly mobile people, whites who experienced above average income gains between 1973 and 1997 became 14 percentage points more Republican overall, while those who experienced below average income gains became only 2 percentage points more Republican. So this is just one part of our broader project trying to exploit these very rich data to look at a variety of aspects of political change in the United States over the past half century. I'm just showing you a list here of other papers that we've produced over the course of the last couple of years on religion, on the impact of the Vietnam War, on the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, on changing conceptions of good citizenship over the course of these people's lives, and on their attitudes about work and welfare and how those have factored into partisan change and shifts in their political attitudes. And all of those papers are posted if you go to my Vanderbilt website and look under working papers, or go to Professor Kramer's website at the University of Wisconsin. You'll be able to see copies of all those papers posted online. I want to just express thanks to Kent Jennings, who created this study and shepherded it for so many years, and Laura Stoker, who was involved in the last wave of the survey in 1997. Both of them have been very cooperative in facilitating our use of the data from the panel study. Monica Bush at Wisconsin, who's been a useful research assistant in terms of tracking down these respondents more than 20 years after they were last contacted. Lots of friends and colleagues and seminar participants in various places around the country and the world who provided comments and discussions on these various papers, and the institutional review boards at our universities who approved and provided oversight for our own interviews with the respondents over the course of the last 2 or 3 years. Thanks to all those people, and thanks to you for listening.
Thank you.
Great. This is really impressive, and I think let me invite anyone who would like to raise a question or give a remark or feedback. Just either speak up or type anything in the chat box, so we will relay the question to Professor Bartels. And please feel free to do that. Now, this allow me to maybe start up with a few questions, because this one is we call ourselves like a data analytics colloquium. We are particularly interested in the data and also the methods you use in this series of research. I think it's not just one paper. Looks like it's like a whole series of research papers and projects coming out of this rich data set. Allow me to ask you this one question about the data over time. Now we have 4 waves, right? So that retention rate is really high. It's like a 50-something%. You still were able to trace individuals, or we call it panelists, and to get the data. And I wonder if you can get more data. Like now, I'm particularly interested in a few things about what are called APC model: aging, age, period, and cohort effects in this long-term panel data. And I think your data has rich evidence showing the aging effect, and but you also couple with um, the SES and sundry other factors like church. I think you said about the secularity, and how do these variables play out? Do you detect any interactions among these uh, um, predictors and age and SES and others? I think you present a really long list of models and very comprehensive. How do they play out with each other, generally speaking?
Well, one of the things that we've looked at is the shift in people's religiosity over time. We have a couple different ways of measuring that. One is
Mm-hmm.
a report of how often they attend church. Another
Mm-hmm.
is a measure that's based on their response to a question about interpretations of the Bible. So basically, if they interpret the
Mm-hmm.
Bible literally as the Word of God, or if they are
Mm-hmm.
less religious in their interpretation of the meaning of the Bible. And both of those are fairly stable attitudes over the course of people's lives, but insofar as they
Mm-hmm.
change, we see that the change is rather different in nature in different periods. There seems to have been a substantial sorting out between 1965, when these people were finishing high school, and their mid 20s. For a lot of people, that was a period in which they may have attended college, they may have
Mm-hmm.
started working, some of them moved to new locations, some of them started families. And in that period, there seems to have been a substantial overall decline in reported church attendance and in
Mm-hmm.
the literal interpretations of the Bible. But the decline wasn't uniform across the entire group. It was very disproportionately concentrated among people who attended college and came from relatively urban and upscale backgrounds. Those were the people who were most likely to defect from religion to a greater or lesser extent in early adulthood, whereas the people who had less education came from more rural areas and lower SES areas were more likely to continue in church and to continue to express strong faith in the Bible. And so I think that's a really important
Mm-hmm.
period socially and politically in terms of really beginning to show what later became a larger cleavage in American society and politics between more and less religious people, and the kinds of people who maintained their religiosity during that stage of life mostly went on to continue to be religious thereafter and developed more conservative political views, whereas the people who tended to fall away from religion during that period, some went back to it to a greater or lesser extent, but many of them never did, and they tended to develop more liberal social attitudes and more liberal political views later on in life. So it looks to us as though that was an important factor in creating the alignment that we see increasingly strongly in contemporary American politics between religion and social attitudes and political attitudes. Analysts have often
Mm-hmm.
focused on a later period in which abortion and gay rights became salient on the political agenda. But it looks as though much of the relevant switching actually occurred before those issues really became prominent and had more to do with people's reactions to the broader cultural shifts of the 1960s and early 1970s, rather than with the specific issues of abortion and gay rights.
Mhm. So that's really interesting. Now we generally understand that age will have some positive relationship to of the leaning toward conservativeness or the supporting GOP or the Republicans. Now you suggest is that actually uh, the the religion or religiosity. I do not know whether so you use either, and should be the one of the main contributors to the cleavage. And now we can see combinations like more like a lower education and uh, go to church more often. Uh, I do not want to. Maybe I do not. You can weigh in on the SES too, and this will be the combination to define the cleavage more clearly between the liberal supporting Democrats and the more conservative supporting the GOP. Will be such a combination. Yeah.
Yes, I think overall the cohort has become more Republican. I think there are probably at least two general reasons for that. One is the aging process that you referred to, although much of the shift that we see in partisanship across different cohorts has more to do with socialization than it does with aging. There does seem to be some conservative effect of aging. The other, as I mentioned, is that this cohort was much more democratic than most cohorts are at the time it was in high school. And so, in a sense, there was really much more scope to move in a Republican direction than there was in a Democratic
Mm-hmm.
direction. Part of this I would interpret as essentially regression to the mean. But
Mm-hmm.
insofar as we look at differentiation in who it was that became more conservative and more Republican over time, it was disproportionately the people who were more religious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Professor Pan, do you have any questions? I do have a lot of questions. I didn't want to take advantage being a co-host and ask all the questions. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the answers. I think I learned a lot from that. But for the floor, I think we have several students right here, and then they would like to ask Professor Bartel some questions. First of all, following that methods that you use, because the cohort research, I think, is really a challenge, right? It's not just like cross-sectional research that you can, which is more economical. So a question is asking is that cohort research, what is your suggestions or for students who are interested in applying these methods, or how do you prepare them before they actually get their hands dirty? This is, first of all, the data per se, it's really hard to get, and then it takes time. So do you have any suggestions for students before they actually use these methods? This is the one question about the methods that you use.
Sure. It certainly is very difficult to gather these data, and I can't begin to express my admiration, especially to Kent Jennings, who spent a large part of his career first getting this project started and then keeping it alive for so many years. I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
hugely valuable resource. It's unfortunate that we don't have lots of studies of this kind. I think we'd be able to understand a lot more about the development of politics if we did. I know my teacher and collaborator, Professor Aiken, was involved at one point in trying to stimulate a similar kind of long-term panel study in Taiwan, which I don't think ever happened. But if it does happen at some point, I think will be a hugely valuable research opportunity. So from students' point of view, it's probably not feasible to attempt to gather these sorts of data yourself, but it is certainly worthwhile to get experience with analyzing the data that are publicly available, not only from the US, but from other countries as well. England has some good long-term panel data. Germany has some very rich panel sets. The Netherlands has some shorter but very rich panel studies. All of these, I think, are rich possibilities for exploration. In terms of how to get started, I think the most important way to start with any data analysis is in terms of simple description. And so looking at the distributions of variables in each wave of the survey, how they changed over time. I often find it useful to just produce simple graphs of how things have changed over time. In terms of understanding the movement of people from wave to wave, I think it's important to keep track of individual respondents and see they're moving from one cell to another rather than simply just computing averages in each wave and losing track of what those averages actually represent in terms of stability and change. So lots of exploratory analysis with very simple methods before you launch into anything sophisticated in terms of being able to analyze the impact of particular explanatory variables over time, I think is the way to proceed.
Carl, you wanna? I have a question.
Yeah, please.
You
Go
want?
ahead.
Yeah. One of the question is here is that so if we're going to use the findings, the research findings from this presentation or the research that you did with Dr. Kramer, and how does this findings apply to the 2016 and the 2020 presidential campaign as to how these partnership issue will affect Trump's edge or Biden's edge. So this is the question that student has asked. There are a couple more questions about this year's campaign, but I'm coming one by one after this question.
Well, it's a good question. It's clearly not possible to use these data that end in 1997 to shed direct light on why people did or didn't vote for President Trump in 2016. But I think the strength of the overall pattern that we see, the relationship between upward economic mobility and conservative shifts in policy preferences and social attitudes and partisanship, cast doubt on the idea that at least that there's a general relationship between economic distress or income stagnation or downward mobility in the long term and political responses of the kind that people thought they saw in 2016. So it's certainly possible as a logical matter that the sorts of patterns that seem to be accounting for these shifts through the second half of the 20th century suddenly reversed and had entirely opposite effects in 2016. But that seems, as a substantive matter, kind of implausible. And at least I think this analysis calls into question the idea that that would be the kind of reaction that we ought to expect from people. And in combination with the weakness of a lot of the evidence that people have adduced in support of that interpretation, it seems to me pretty unlikely that that's really a cogent explanation for the shifting that we observed toward Donald Trump in 2016. In 2020, it's hard to know. I mean, we don't have these sorts of survey data for 2020 yet. What I've mostly seen in the survey analyses that I have been able to look at is that the shifts in support from 2016 to 2020 in particular social groups have mostly been quite uniform. So, for example, there's been a lot of talk about suburban women and whether suburban women have turned against President Trump. They are less supportive of President Trump in current surveys than they were in their voting behavior in 2016, but only to the same extent that lots of other groups, women, men, suburban, urban, rural, all these groups seem to have moved to more or less the same extent away from President Trump between 2016 and 2020, which suggests roughly at least that the most likely explanation for whatever shifts we'll observe have more to do with across the board reactions to his performance as president and the state of the economy and the state of the COVID pandemic, rather than with specific reactions that are grounded in people's own particular social attachments. But we'll need much more data and analysis in order to be able to figure that out. The qualitative interviewing that we've done over the course of the last couple of years doesn't include enough people to make any very definitive conclusions about the role of economic mobility in attitudes toward President Trump specifically, although much of what we see, as I tried to indicate with the particular comparison of two people that I showed from the same high school, is more consistent with our interpretation of the evidence from the second half of the 20th century than it is with the press speculation that I referred to about the 2016 election.
Peter, let me relay a question from one of our students here, UTD. Aaron Hawley asked a question about the SES. One of the things that stood out to me early in the presentation was the impact of school SES on economic mobility. And he was just wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that relationship, school SES.
Yeah, I found it very striking as well,
Mm.
especially the extent to which it seems to increase over the course of people's lives. We've tried to get that at that some in our interviews as well. I think the book that we're working on will have a chapter on how these fundamental backgrounds influence people's lives and their life chances over the long term. It looks as though people from affluent backgrounds are better supported by social networks and by access to community resources over the course of their lives. One of the people that we talked to was somebody who went to a rather elite private school, and clearly his experience in that school was an important force in shaping the opportunities that he had later in life, helped him get into a fancy college, helped him get a high status, high paying job, and so on. So I think that's a kind of an indication of how the school background or the environment that people are growing up in can matter, even distinct from their own family circumstances. Part of it as well probably is just capturing general social advantages that people in some communities have by comparison with others. The poorest schools by far in our sample were the ones that were in that period almost entirely racially segregated schools in which all of the students were African American, many in the South. And so that was a particular kind of disadvantageous social background that probably had a big impact on some of our respondents' lives, but there were also a fair number of white schools in rural areas that were quite poor communities. And as we saw in the couple of examples that I gave to you, those seem to have influenced people as well.
It's interesting. Let me give me one more opportunity to ask a question, Peter. Sorry. Uh, I think your presentation also prompts me to think about the expectations or the expected mobility of this population that could have fueled the support for Trump. For example, the 1990s and then the 2000s saw that the country joining joining the globalization, outsourcing a lot of the works, jobs to other countries, leaving this mobility expectation or expected mobility coming to a halt or coming to uh, a break without or stripping some of the middle class with the mobility they believe they deserve, then that could lead to frustration and then feel the support for Trump, who is particularly putting anti-globalization on his agenda. Will that be something maybe the interview or the qualitative data shed light on about relative deprivation or the expected mobility is stripped and something like that?
We didn't hear much of that in talking to people. Actually, the person who was probably most focused on economic competition, global economic competition, and factory closings and so on, was this guy, Ron Sutton, who I described in the presentation, who was not a poor factory worker who'd lost his job. He was a factory owner who had to close his factory, but then went on to another lucrative position in a big corporation.
Manager, yeah.
I think there are a couple situations that are worth distinguishing here. There are some specific parts of the economy in which there have been significant economic dislocations and a partisan connection. So, for example, reporters who want to push this story always go to West Virginia and talk to out-of-work coal miners because the coal mining industry has declined substantially over the course of the last couple of decades. And people in that circumstance have often interpreted their plight in partisan terms. They think of Democrats with their emphasis on environmental protection having imposed lots of regulations that contributed to closing coal mines. And so they have pretty distinctively moved toward the Republican Party. If you look at the state of West Virginia, it was historically one of the most reliably Democratic states and is now a very Republican state. But I think that's kind of a special case. More generally, if you look at instances of economic decline, you find that the people who are most Republican in these communities are not the workers or especially the displaced workers. Those people often continue to be Democrats. The people who are more likely to be Republicans are the people who are maybe less educated. They're likely not people who have college degrees, but they're people who are further up the income distribution, at least within the context of their own communities. They're people who are small business owners or work as managers more than they are people who are working class in the classical sense. There's a lot of confusion in analyses of this kind, in part just because of differences in the way people use the terminology. A lot of people nowadays refer to working class as people who don't have college degrees. One thing to recognize is that that's still a majority of the population, and so it's not a very specific definition of the working class. And also that the correlation between education and income, although it's significant, is not that substantial. And so it's important to bear in mind that in many of these situations, income and education actually have contrasting social and political effects. And in the political domain, um, it's become increasingly the case over the last few decades that relatively well-educated people, on average, have become more democratic, but relatively affluent people have actually continued to be more Republican. If you look at the average income levels of people who voted for Trump and Clinton in 2016, on average, the Trump voters were more affluent than the Clinton voters. But people often lose sight of that if they focus on particular rich and poor localities in which the reverse is the case.
Peter, do you have more questions from your side?
Yeah, a couple of them. And then after this, probably to the chat box. Still, I think the question is short and quick. Again, it's about, somehow we're concerned about the campaign for this year. So following the previous questions, could you share some of your viewpoints on how this is a question, how the Hunter Biden issue, and that's the number one, and the other is Trump's anti-China strategy affect the campaign. So that's the question I read out from my students here. And yeah, I'll just give another question to you, and you can all answer that together. There's an increasing sentiment, if any, that today's opinion polls on presidential campaign are not representative. So what do you think about this issue? This is two questions. Yeah.
Sure. I have to say that generally my view about voting behavior is that analysts talk about and focus way too much on specific issues, and that usually if an issue seems to be important, it's mostly simply because people who've decided on other grounds to vote one way or the other fasten on this as a reason for voting the way they want to. I think the Hunter Biden scandal, if that's what it is a perfect example of this. There's really nobody in the country, I think, who really cares strongly about Hunter Biden and what he did. But because the Republicans have been talking it up as a reason not to support Joe Biden, people who are going to support the president fasten on that as a good reason for why they're going to behave the way they are. But my guess is that, to a good approximation, the real impact of that issue is 0.00. With Trump's rhetoric about China, similarly, I think there's some difference here in that there are people who are likely to be mobilized in a kind of ethnocentric way by attacks on China or on any foreign country. It's probably not a matter of Trump's policy positions toward China influencing their views, but rather them being sympathetic in general to complaints about this foreign power trying to influence our country and to treat our workers unfairly and so on. And in connection with the pandemic, particularly the idea that we should somehow blame China for the fact that the pandemic has had such a negative impact in the United States and elsewhere. I think the impact of the pandemic itself is probably an order of magnitude more important than the impact of the president's attempts to associate it specifically with China. As for polling generally, over time it's become increasingly difficult to do good polling. especially when people are trying to do telephone surveys. So many people either don't have landlines at all or no longer answer them consistently. And so the response rate for telephone surveys, which had always been pretty poor, is now abysmal. And it's very hard, I think, to get very accurate responses that way. What polling firms have increasingly done in response to that is to switch to trying to do surveys online. There are various ways to do that. Typically, they involve trying to weight the responses that you get in some way in order to make them look like a representative sample of the population. And that can be done well or badly. Even when it's done well, there are potential pitfalls, certainly, in trying to interpret those data. But I think the polls probably have improved some since 2016. The failure of the polls in the so-called blue wall states, the upper Midwest industrial states that switched to Trump in 2016. I think a lot of the analysis of those polling failures suggested that it was important to be sure to have a sample that was representative with respect to education. And so pollsters this time around are being more careful about doing that. And as a result, I suspect that their results will be somewhat more accurate this time than they were last time around. But it's a difficult business these days.
All right. Is it okay I ask the questions in the chat box now, Peter?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I have another student, George Cuba, and I have two questions since your research concludes or finds no support for the notion of a Republican backlash rooted in the long-term economic grievance. And then how does the term or concept of economic anxiety, popularized as a plausible explanation of the motivation of some 2016 voters, fall into the scope of your research? Question number one. Question number two is, can this conclusion indicate that the 2016 Trump phenomenon is predictable with other data metrics?
On the first question, I would say that the popularity of the interpretation of the election in terms of economic anxiety was overblown even in its own terms. I think there are a lot of analysts who are more comfortable thinking about people voting on the basis of economic concerns than they are on the basis of racial or ethnic antagonisms of one kind or another. But the most careful analyses of survey data, including some panel data that go back to 2011 and follow people in the years leading up to the 2016 election, suggest that attitudes about immigrants and what's referred to in the literature as racial resentment had much more substantial impact on people's voting behavior in 2016 than economic anxiety per se. And insofar as economic anxiety did matter, it seems to have been activated by these racial and ethnic tensions and antagonisms rather than the other way around. So I think the emphasis on economic anxiety was a kind of comfortable exaggeration on the part of analysts in the first place. As to the second question about shifts between 2016 and 2020, I think it would be hard to use these kinds of data in order to shed light on what we would expect in terms of those kinds of shifts. I think of this really as being more useful to explain what we observe in the way of shifts rather than to predict shifts. Generally speaking, the best way to predict the results of presidential elections is through some combination of two important long-term factors, one of which is how long the incumbent party has been in power, the other of which is the economic conditions of the country in the months leading up to the election, not long-term economic conditions, but quite short-term economic conditions, mixed in with some evidence from contemporary polling about how people seem to be interpreting the situation and presidential approval and so on. So in 2020, the Republican Party has a significant advantage due to the fact that they've only held the White House for 4 years. Generally, that would make it easier to get reelected. If the economic situation today looked like it did a year ago, President Trump's chances would probably be a lot better than they are right now. There's been a big economic decline over the course of the last 6 months. It's a little bit garbled in terms of trying to apply directly the historical models that we've developed, because those models are not very definitive regarding the particular economic metric that's likely to be most important. Some analysts have focused on growth in GDP per capita. Some have focused on growth in real incomes per capita. I've normally done the latter rather than the former, since that seems to fit the historical data better. In a typical year, it doesn't make much difference because those two tend to move more or less in tandem. But this year, they've moved quite differently because of the huge government response to the pandemic and the attempt to shield people from the economic fallout from the pandemic. So typically, the period that we look at is roughly the second and third quarters of the election year. So the period running from about when the lockdowns started in the spring through about now. If you look at the second quarter, which is the only one that we have data for so far, the growth in real GDP per capita was minus 10%. So a huge economic decline by historical standards. But the growth in real personal income per capita, taking account of what people got in the way of government benefits, actually increased by 10%. So that's a huge economic boom, but obviously a very artificial economic boom that was produced by deficit spending on the part of the federal government. And that boom has now been turned off. Most of the increased unemployment benefits and relief for businesses that had to close and lay off workers and so on ended at the end of July. And so the third quarter numbers, even for real income, I think are going to be much worse than the second quarter income numbers were. And so I think overall the economic situation is going to contribute significantly to Biden's support rather than Trump's, make it much harder for Trump to win the election.
Hello, Peter. Do you have more questions on the side?
Yep. So there's one more question right here. Some research shows that there's a tendency of increasing bipolar partisanship among the American people, or in other ways, the political neutral people that are decreasing. Then actually some of actually the data that you just show seems to show the kind of tendency too, right? Moving toward the Republican, or I mean the population wise. So the question is this tendency reflected on the election turnout? And the other question is, what does this phenomenon implies on American politics in the future?
There has been a pretty substantial increase in partisan polarization, depending on exactly how you measure it. In some cases over the last 40 years, in some cases really concentrated over the last 20 years or even the last 5 or 10 years. The data that I showed for this particular cohort, I think, partly reflects that, but also reflects the more general tendency of people to become more partisan as they age. Most people don't have very strong partisan attachments early in life, although they do tend to inherit some kind of partisan dispositions from their families. As they go on in life and pay attention to politics and have political experiences, they generally tend to gravitate toward one of the parties or the other. And so we often see a increase in the strength of party identification over the life cycle. And so I think what we observe in these data is partly that and partly the more general polarization of the American public in this period. I think it's useful to say that that polarization is limited to a fraction of the population. It's a significant fraction of the population, but there are a fair number of people still who are relatively disengaged from the political process and have mostly reacted to the increasing ratcheting up of partisan intensity by tuning out of politics. So you do find people who are doing their best not to take sides and to avoid the whole thing. But insofar as people are politically active and politically attentive, they have increasingly associated themselves with one party or the other. And that's important for a whole variety of reasons, maybe the most important, which is that people's interpretations of what's going on in the world are strongly colored by their partisanship. And so we increasingly see that Republicans and Democrats disagree strongly about even the most basic political facts. So not only interpretations about, people might have different ideological views about how the economy works and how the world works and what the impact of particular policies are. But even if you just look at simple objective facts like whether the unemployment rate has gone up or down, or whether the budget deficit has gone up or down, people have very different views depending upon their partisan biases. And so that makes it increasingly hard for people to even agree on reality, much less to agree on how we ought to respond to reality.
Yes, I think I have I have no questions on my side of students now, and I think this is Peter. Do you have more questions?
I hear one more.
Yeah,
May
please
I?
proceed. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question about social welfare. During this campaign, Trump, that's a very special his character, white character. And then what about the social welfare issue? Because in your presentation, it kind of shows that people toward the feeling toward the social welfare kind of changing too, right? Not just the partisanship, but in terms of the viewpoint, the feelings toward welfare. I think that's if we just take this out and as a specific issue. So what do you think that today's American people still think about this in terms of the two parties? Strong, either pro liberal, or is it more conservative toward the social welfare? And does this affect this campaign? Because it's pandemic, and that involves a lot of welfare issues. So what do you think about this one in terms of social welfare?
I should say that in our broader project, one of the things that we are trying to do is to disentangle the reciprocal effects of attitudes about policies like social welfare and partisanship. And insofar as we've been able to do that, it looks like there are some effects in both directions, but often what's happening is that people's views about these issues are being shaped by their partisanship as much or more as their partisanship is being shaped by their views about the issues. But on social welfare, it's an interesting issue because one of the things that people noticed as being distinctive about Trump when he ran in 2016 by comparison with previous Republican candidates is that, at least in broad terms, he was less conservative on social spending issues than previous Republican presidential candidates had been. He talked about bolstering Social Security, for example. He hasn't followed through on that in office, and so I think he now looks to people much more like a conventional Republican president than he did when he first ran in 2016. I think it's also important to differentiate between social welfare in a broad sense of government involvement in the economy, supporting people's living standards, and what Americans refer to specifically as welfare, which is really a much smaller program that provides targeted benefits to very poor people. Those kinds of programs are generally less popular, and people's attitudes about them are often inflected by their attitudes about the specific groups that they view as beneficiaries of those programs, like African Americans. And Trump's rhetoric about those groups, I think, has helped him to attract support from people who are concerned about the impact of welfare programs in that narrow sense, but also have turned off people who have more supportive views of those groups and of welfare programs. More generally, I think Trump sent kind of mixed signals in terms of government spending and the response to the pandemic. At sometimes he's argued for a big stimulus in addition to what's already been done, but then at other times he signaled a kind of lack of patience with both Republicans who've been resisting that kind of policy move and with Democrats who want a big stimulus package, but want some elements of it that he strongly opposes, like aid to state and local governments.
So, Carl, do you have a question of your own?
Oh, I think I have a lot, but I think that we have about time, and I would like to also give a couple of announcements and before we wrap and to wrap up this section. Peter, I still like to entertain more questions from your side. Do you have more questions?
I think that would be all for now.
All for now, great. Yeah, I really like to give a big thank you to Professor Bartels. This is really impressive research, and it's like a gold mine. And we only get into a small, a quick peek, and there are more data coming out of his research, and also this multi-wave spanning 4 decades, right? It's close to 4 decades of panel data. And with this, I think this is so far, I never see a project like this giving decades of data from the same panelist. Then we can use this data to see more. And I shared Dr. Portel's PDF in the chat box, and also the file is in our Colloquium GitHub. Please feel free to download it and read his research on his website. And I want to say thank you again. And this is a really great night. It's like a feast. And thank you very much, Professor Bartel. And maybe we can give him a big virtual round of applause. This is what we can do, and you can use the hand to raise your hand to give an applause, or you can wave a hand here. I really appreciate it. This is great. Now, great. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So, yeah, this is something really, yeah. Go ahead,
It's not virtual.
Peter.
Yeah. 讲一下好不好？给他听一听好了。
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
It's not virtual.
Okay.
We have the.
All right. And
site.
All right. Professor Patel just left. And before you go, and I want to give a little bit more announcements. And we have all this loaded to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our channel so you can get the videos archived in our YouTube channel. You can visit and review the materials there. And we have, please visit our website at dacolloquium.com. Now, there are more events upcoming that feature great talks. And next week we will have Michael Lewisbeck and Colin Lewisbeck talking about forecasting 2020 elections. So this will be another great talk, and I'm personally we're looking forward to. And Michael Lewisbeck is one of the most famous scholars studying elections in the United States, and particularly on what we call the economic voting. And he has multiple books and really well cited, I think thousands of citations already talking about different economic voting models. Now, Mike will come aboard, and with Colin coming aboard. Now we have more talks, and upcoming we'll have Professor Kosuke Imai, and from Harvard University. And Imai is a good friend of mine, and also he's one of the most influential political methodologists. Please feel free to visit our website to register for these upcoming events, and there'll be more lineup, and you can get more detail. But please be sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, and stay tuned to our website with more announcement, more upcoming events, information to be posted there. And we are building a subscription list, and we will work on a subscription. Please stay tuned, subscribing to our websites and our social media channels, and stay tuned, please. All right, Peter, do you have anything to announce also?
Oh, thanks for doing all the work. Thank you very much. So stay tuned, and please become back on next Fridays.
Okay, next Thursday on in Dallas time. Yeah. All right.
There's United States. All right. Good night, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good weekend. Thank you.